What was beauty worth when the wind carried the scent of death and the sea kept its own counsel? For the men who crossed her path, the answer came too late. She was called many names. Some whispered in awe, others spat in envy. But the one that clung to her like salt to skin was the most beautiful pirate queen of the seas. Beauty, however, was only the first weapon in her arsenal. The true danger lay in how she wielded it, not as a fragile ornament, but as a blade hidden in silk, sharper than any cutlass. Her ship cut across the water like a black arrow loosed at the horizon, sails taut with wind, the hull humming with a strange rhythm, discipline wrapped in the illusion of chaos. The queen understood what most pirates did not. The body was a vessel as vital as the ship itself, and it too required maintenance, strategy, and cunning. A man who collapsed from fever could not man the guns. A woman wasted from hunger could not steer through a storm. And so, hidden beneath the shimmer of her allure was an unrelenting command. We stay alive because I demand it. You might think of pirates as reckless, living each day with a bottle in hand, gambling that tomorrow might never come. But the queen played a longer game. On her deck, rum was rationed, and the food was chosen not for indulgence, but endurance. Dried salted meat, ship's biscuits hard as stone, casks of clean water guarded like treasure, these were her gold. Yet she understood that mere survival was not enough. The crew had to remain strong, agile, and sharp-minded. Citrus fruits, if they could be stolen or traded for, were hoarded and meted out, warding off the creeping death of scurvy. If you had sailed under her flag, you would have noticed how few of her men bore the pale gums and swollen joints that cursed other ships. It was no accident. And then there was the matter of discipline. Many pirate captains ruled through terror, their crews obeying only so long as fear outweighed hunger. But fear was a blunt weapon, and the queen preferred precision. She understood that loyalty could be nourished like the body, fed with small acts that bound men to her cause. The wounded were tended with poultices stolen from apothecaries, the feverish cooled with wet cloths, the injured given time to heal rather than discarded into the sea. Such mercy was rare on the open water, and it made her crew fight harder for her than for their own lives. Still, mercy was not weakness. Her punishments were infamous, not for their cruelty, but for their artistry. A man caught stealing from the food stores might be lashed not with rope, but with silence, shunned by the crew until he begged for forgiveness. A deserter brought back alive might find himself chained to the mast through a full tide cycle, lashed by wind and salt spray until his skin burned raw. These were not punishments meant merely to harm, but they were performances, each one etching itself into the memory of every watching sailor. Imagine yourself on that deck in the heat of midday, the horizon stretching endlessly in all directions. The sea offers no refuge, no escape. Every breath you take is claimed by her authority. And when she walks among the crew, her presence draws eyes as surely as the moon draws the tide. Not just because she is beautiful, though she is in a way that is almost dangerous to look at, but because she is the axis around which the ship turns. Her beauty is a lure, yes, but it is also a shield, a distraction, a reminder that even in a world ruled by violence, refinement can command obedience. Beneath that beauty, her mind worked like a navigator's compass, ever measuring, adjusting, steering. She knew when to push her crew to the brink and when to let them rest, when to show kindness and when to tighten the rope. This balance was not instinct alone. It was born of study, of careful observation. She had learned from the failures of other captains, those who drank themselves into a stupor, who let disease ravage their ranks, who mistook brutality for strength. Where they fell, she endured. There were whispers in every port about how her crew never seemed as ragged or starved as the others, how their eyes were clearer, their movements more precise. Sailors from other ships muttered about strange rituals, about the way she would order her men to wash in seawater daily, to stretch their limbs at dawn, to drink measured amounts of water rather than gulp it down. Some laughed at these habits, calling them superstitions, but those same men would fall coughing in the damp holds of their own ships, while her crew strode ashore like predators. And yet even the sharpest blade dulls when used too often. The queen knew her beauty was both her power and her burden. Men underestimated her at their peril, but the attention it drew was constant, exhausting. Port authorities plotted to capture her, not only for her crimes, but because she was a trophy, a prize to parade. Rivals sought her downfall, not simply to claim her ship, but to see the woman who had outwitted them brought low. Every victory she won, every raid that left her crew richer and her enemies poorer, deepened both her legend and the hunger of those who wished to see her hang. In the quiet hours between tides, she must have known the truth, that allure has a price, and the sea always collects its debts. The only question was when and how. And as her ship sailed into deeper waters, she was already making the choices that would decide whether that debt would be paid in coin or in blood. The deeper waters were her kingdom, but they were also her crucible. Out here, storms did not just tear at sails, they tested the bones of a crew, the sinew of command, the invisible threads binding men to their captain. The queen understood that survival at sea was a contest of endurance, and she prepared her people not with empty bravado, but with meticulous calculation. When the wind rose and the waves climbed, other captains relied on superstition, nailing charms to masts, whispering prayers to the depths. She did not waste breath on such things. Instead, she had drilled her crew in storm routines so often that when the sky blackened, each man and woman moved without hesitation, their actions as synchronized as the pistons of a great engine. The weakest would be secured below deck, the strongest lashed to rigging, the ballast adjusted with ruthless precision. These measures preserved not just the ship, but the bodies within it, guarding the crew's strength for the next battle or the next storm. Even in calmer weather, the Queen treated the voyage as a campaign of constant readiness. You would have seen her overseeing ration inspections personally, ensuring that barrels were rotated, salted meat aired, and biscuits kept dry. A single infestation of weevils could undermine months of careful planning, and she would not tolerate such carelessness. Those who handled the stores did so under her watchful eye, aware that the smallest lapse would be noticed. To outsiders, this might have seemed obsessive, but to her, it was simply the cost of power. It was power she maintained not only through discipline, but through control of information. Her crew never knew her full plans until the moment of action, and this secrecy protected them as much as it protected her. If captured, a sailor could only reveal fragments, routes half-spoken, destinations hinted at but never confirmed. This secrecy created an aura around her, a sense that she was always 3 steps ahead, that she could see currents others could not. In truth, she was always calculating, revising, and preparing. Her survival, and the survival of her crew, depended on it. But no matter how sharp the mind or how strong the body, the sea could still take its toll. Salt air stiffened joints, dampness rotted teeth, the constant motion wore at the soul. To fight this, the queen turned to methods learned in the markets and back alleys of ports from Havana to Calcutta. She had gathered a small apothecary aboard, dried herbs, fermented tonics, strange roots wrapped in oilcloth. Some were remedies for fever or nausea, others were stimulants that could keep a man on his feet for 2 days without sleep. She dispensed these sparingly, always aware that overuse would dull their edge. She also cultivated something rarer than any medicine: pride. Her crew was not merely surviving, they were thriving compared to other pirates, and they knew it. This pride was a weapon as potent as any blade, for it made them unwilling to break ranks, unwilling to tarnish the name they sailed under. They were the crew of the most beautiful pirate queen in the seas, and that meant something. It meant they ate better, fought harder, and outlasted their enemies. It meant their ship arrived in port with sails intact and crew unbroken, while others limped in with torn canvas and hollow eyes. You might think that such a ship would be free of dissent, but the truth is more complex. Even under her rule, ambition simmered. Some envied her command, others whispered about her methods, questioning why so much attention was given to health and readiness rather than immediate plunder. She allowed these murmurs to exist, knowing that stamping them out entirely would only drive them deeper. But when a whisper grew into an open challenge, she acted swiftly. One such challenge came from a gunner, broad-shouldered, quick with a blade, and foolish enough to think beauty equaled weakness. She accused her of hoarding supplies, of favoring certain crew members. She listened in silence, her gaze steady until she had finished. Then she ordered the stores opened and inspected in front of the entire crew. The barrels were full, the supplies accounted for. And then, without raising her voice, she pronounced his sentence. For the next fortnight, he would eat last, after the youngest cabin boy had taken his share. No lash, no blood, just hunger and humiliation. By the time his punishment ended, his shoulders were thinner, and his eyes no longer met hers. Incidents like these reinforced the truth. She did not need to shout to command. Her strength lay in the precision of her actions, the knowledge that every choice she made had a purpose. Her beauty might draw eyes, but it was her mind that held them. And still, beneath the order and the strategy, the shadow of the price she would pay lingered. Power like hers could not exist without enemies, and beauty such as hers drew hunters as surely as it drew admirers. Somewhere, perhaps just beyond the horizon, there were those plotting her end, not through battle alone, but through deceit, betrayal, and the slow erosion of the discipline she had built. The queen knew it was only a matter of time before the first fracture appeared. And when it did, it would not be the storm or the cannon that decided her fate. It would be the loyalty of the bodies she had kept strong and the hearts she had bound to her cause. The fracture began, as such things often do, in silence. No mutiny's first breath is a roar. It is a whisper, a glance exchanged in the shadow of the foremast, a conversation paused when boots pass too close. For weeks, perhaps months, the queen felt it before she could name it. The energy on deck shifted. Laughter became rarer. Men worked with the same precision, but their eyes seemed distant, fixed on some unspoken horizon. She had seen it before on other ships, how the sea's isolation could ferment discontent like rum in a dark cask. Hunger for more gold, resentment of the ration rules, jealousy of her command, these were familiar poisons. But this was something sharper. It was not mere greed or boredom. This was ambition, concentrated in a single figure.
a man whose survival she herself had ensured months before, when he had been carried aboard with fever and blackened fingers from frostbite. She had ordered him treated, his fingers amputated cleanly, his wounds dressed daily until the stumps healed. Now he moved with a sailor's grace again, but his gratitude had soured into calculation. His name was Malric, clever enough to hide his thoughts, charming enough to plant them in others. He began to speak of opportunities the Queen's caution had cost them. Ships passed without boarding, ports avoided, cargoes not seized. In his telling, her obsession with health and preparation was not wisdom, but weakness, a refusal to grasp at the wealth that drifted within reach. And for men who had grown used to the taste of her discipline, the promise of more gold glittered like a siren's call. You might imagine she would have had him thrown overboard at the first sign of disloyalty. But the Queen was not reckless. She knew that striking too soon could splinter the crew, turning suspicion into open rebellion. Instead, she watched. She listened. She began to gather her own intelligence, speaking quietly with those whose loyalty she had earned most deeply, not with threats, but with trust. These were the ones who had been at her side in storms, who had eaten the same rations as the others, who had seen her tend to the sick without regard for her own comfort. They told her what she needed to hear. Malric was not merely stirring dissatisfaction, he was planning. Yet even in this, she did not act immediately. There is power in letting a plan ripen, in allowing the conspirator to believe he is unseen. She adjusted the ship's course subtly, steering toward a stretch of sea she knew well, a place where the currents ran fast, where the wind could die without warning, and where the narrow passages offered no easy escape. If Malric made his move, it would be here, where she could control the field like a chessboard. In the days that followed, she doubled down on the very measures Malric despised. Rations were inspected more often. Morning exercises became longer, harsher. The apothecary chest was opened and its contents tallied. To the restless, these acts seemed like overreach, proof that Malric was right, but to her loyal core they were a signal. The Queen was aware, and the Queen was ready. It was on the fourth night in those waters that the wind died, leaving the ship adrift under a moonless sky. The sea lay flat and dark, a sheet of glass broken only by the creak of timbers and the soft slap of water against the hull. It was then that Malric made his move. A small group of men, those most taken with his promises, began to gather near the stern, speaking in low tones. Their plan was crude: seize the helm, lock the Queen in her cabin, and force the quartermaster to sail toward richer hunting grounds. But they underestimated the speed with which she could act. She stepped into their circle without a sound, her presence as sudden as a shadow crossing the moon. No cutlass in hand, no pistol, only the weight of her gaze, which silenced them more effectively than any weapon. Then she spoke, her voice low but carrying across the deck. "Do you think I keep you alive so you can die in the first skirmish your greed brings? Do you think I built this ship's name on chance?" Malric opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, cutting him off. From the shadows emerged half a dozen loyal crewmen, armed and ready. The Queen's voice did not rise, it did not need to. "You can have gold, or you can have a ship. Choose now, because you will not have both." The men hesitated, and in that hesitation the mutiny collapsed. Malric was seized, bound, and dragged to the mast. But there was no blood that night. Instead, she sentenced him to the same punishment she had once given the thieving gunner: eating last, drinking last, sleeping in the open. Every man on board knew that in the open sea this was a slow execution if a man's will broke. But for Malric, the punishment was worse than death. It was irrelevance. Her handling of the rebellion cemented her legend, but it also deepened the undercurrent of danger. She had shown she could crush dissent without spilling blood, but she had also revealed that she expected it. And in the minds of those who still dreamed of taking her place, that knowledge became both a warning and a challenge.
The days after Malric's fall were strangely calm, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. The wind returned, filling the sails with a steady push eastward, and the crew moved about their work with a deliberate quiet. Yet beneath that surface lay a sharpened awareness. The Queen had faced down a mutiny without firing a shot, without staining the deck red, and still emerged unchallenged. For some, it was proof of her unshakable command. For others, it was a reminder that she would never allow her crew's will to outpace her own. She used this lull not to bask in her victory, but to fortify her position. The Queen knew the sea had its own cycles. Calm always bred complacency, and complacency was the first crack in a ship's armor. Her eyes scanned the horizon each morning, not for enemy sails alone, but for signs of nature's cruelty: the shifting hue of the water that signaled an undercurrent, the thin line of darker clouds that could hide a squall. She demanded the same vigilance from her officers, and they learned quickly that a missed sign, however small, could earn a cold, cutting rebuke in front of the crew. But the measures that truly preserved her reign went beyond weather and watch shifts. She began tightening her circle, holding closed-door meetings in her cabin with only her most trusted, men and women who had proven loyalty not through words, but through action. These were the ones who had stood firm in the storms, who had obeyed without hesitation when her orders seemed impossible. To them, she revealed pieces of her larger strategy: a route that would keep them supplied longer than other pirate ships, an alliance with a shadowy broker in Nassau who could provide rare medicines in exchange for stolen Spanish silk, a plan to prey on not heavily armed merchantmen, but on lightly guarded supply ships bound for colonial outposts. If you had been part of those meetings, you would have seen the precision in her thinking. Every move had two purposes, one visible, one hidden. The visible purpose kept the crew engaged, confident they were working toward tangible gain. The hidden one ensured the long-term survival of the ship, the preservation of its strength for moments when others would be foundering. This duality was her art: to let the crew believe they were chasing gold while she was securing endurance. She also began a more subtle campaign, one of influence. The Queen knew that beauty alone could draw men's eyes, but to command their hands and hearts required something deeper. She shared stories at the evening meal, sometimes of victories, sometimes of near disasters turned aside by quick thinking. These tales were never random. Each carried a lesson. A botched raid turned into a parable about the dangers of overconfidence. A successful ambush was told as a triumph of patience. By weaving herself into the ship's oral history, she became not just its leader, but its living myth. And yet, there was a darker current flowing beneath her discipline. She had begun to understand that her allure, once the perfect mask, was becoming the very thing enemies sought to exploit. In certain ports, she could no longer step ashore without drawing a dangerous amount of attention. Admiralty agents had been seen lingering in taverns she favored, sketching crude likenesses of her face. Rival captains spoke openly of the bounty her capture would bring. Some offered coin to their crews for any scrap of information on her course.
It was here that her health strategies for the crew took on a new dimension. She realized that in a world where she could not always hide herself, she could still hide her men. She began implementing measures to make her crew harder to identify. Uniform tunics when approaching ports, false scars painted on faces, hair cut or dyed with plant-based pigments. To an outside observer, the crew of her ship never looked the same twice. This constant shifting of appearances served another purpose too. It made her people feel part of something larger, something elusive and untouchable. Her ship itself became a chameleon. The black sails that had once been her signature could be swapped for weathered brown canvas. The figurehead at the prow was detachable, replaced with others stolen from lesser vessels. She even had carpenters alter the silhouette of the hull with temporary wooden additions, so that to an untrained eye, her vessel might seem like any merchant ship crossing the horizon. This was not just evasion, it was psychological warfare. To her enemies, the idea that she could be anywhere, under any flag, gnawed at their nerves. Still, there was a price to be paid for constant disguise and vigilance. The Queen felt it in the eyes of her crew. Respect, yes, but also fatigue. The endless drills, the strict rations, the shifting identities, it wore on them. Even the most loyal began to wonder if they were chasing a dream that had no end. And in that creeping doubt, the Queen saw the seeds of her next great challenge. Because loyalty, like health, must be nourished. She had built her empire on the belief that discipline could hold men together through any hardship. But discipline alone could not warm a man's heart on a cold watch, or soothe the ache in a woman's bones after weeks at sea. She would have to give them something more, something beyond survival, and the moment to do so was approaching faster than the clouds on the far horizon.
It came in the form of a merchant convoy, a gift from the sea, though at first glance it seemed an impossible prize. 5 ships, heavy in the water with cargo, escorted by a single, modestly armed sloop. To most pirates, it was a dream worth the risk of a pitched battle. To the Queen, it was an opportunity to feed her crew's hunger for both gold and glory, without gambling the ship's future. She studied the convoy from a distance, her spyglass tracing the rhythm of its movements. The escort sloop kept to the outer flank, far enough to challenge an approach, but close enough to respond to any sudden strike. The merchant vessels were sluggish, their sails pulling awkwardly in the light wind, suggesting a crew more accustomed to calm coastal waters than the restless open sea. She weighed every detail, the angle of the sun, the tide's pull, the speed at which the convoy turned in formation. By the time she lowered the glass, her plan was already forming. Her crew gathered on the quarterdeck, eyes sharp with anticipation. They expected the order to prepare for battle, to load the guns and run the black flag up the mast. Instead, she spoke quietly, almost casually. "We will take them without firing a shot," she said, "and they will thank us for it." The plan unfolded with the precision of a surgeon's cut. At dawn, her ship approached under false colors, sails trimmed to mimic the lazy gait of a friendly trader. The crew played their parts flawlessly, lounging at the rails, some pretending to mend nets, others to scrub the deck, all dressed in plain merchant garb. From a distance, they looked harmless, perhaps even vulnerable. The escort sloop, lulled by the sight, drifted closer to investigate. That was when the Queen struck, not with cannon fire, but with misdirection. As the escort closed in, she ordered a small boat lowered, carrying barrels covered in canvas. The sight suggested a desperate trade, goods in exchange for water or food. The escort captain, cautious but curious, allowed the boat to draw near. Beneath the canvas, however, were not goods, but armed men.
their weapons hidden until the moment they swarmed aboard the sloop. The fight was quick, silent, and decisive. Within minutes, the escort was under her control, its crew bound, and its guns pointed harmlessly toward the sea. With the escort neutralized, the merchant vessels were left defenseless. Rather than terrorize them, the Queen sailed alongside and hailed their captains, offering protection in exchange for a portion of their cargo. It was a theater of civility, her voice calm, her smile disarming. Faced with the choice of parting with some goods or risking destruction, the merchants agreed. By nightfall, her hold was filled with fresh food, clean water, fine cloth, and a cache of rare spices, enough to lift her crew's spirits and restock their supplies for months. That night, the ship came alive in a way it had not for weeks. Barrels of citrus were rolled onto the deck, their bright scent cutting through the usual salt and tar. Casks of fresh wine were opened, and for once the Queen allowed the rationing rules to loosen. There was singing, laughter, the rhythmic stamp of boots in time to shanties. Men and women who had grown gaunt under the strain of discipline now tore into roasted meat, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns. You might think this was mere indulgence, a captain rewarding her crew after a victory. But it was more than that. The Queen understood that health was not measured solely in muscle and bone. It lived in the spirit as well. A crew that believed itself favored by fortune would endure hardships longer, fight harder, and forgive more. That night, every sailor aboard believed the sea itself had blessed them, and by extension, her. She moved among them like the tide, never staying too long in one place, yet touching each group, offering a word here, a toast there. The glow of the lanterns softened her sharp edges, and for a few hours she was not just their captain or their queen, she was their talisman, the embodiment of their luck. She let them see her laugh, let them believe she too was lifted by the feast. And in the quiet hours after the revelry, when the last songs faded into the dark, she walked the deck alone. Her gaze swept over the calm water, and she felt the truth settle on her shoulders like a familiar weight. Tonight's bounty had bought her time, perhaps even devotion, but it had also drawn eyes. Somewhere, those merchants would speak of the beautiful pirate queen who had taken their goods with a smile. Somewhere, a rival or an admiral would hear the story and add another line to the price on her head. This was the price of allure, of strategy, of survival in a world where each victory fed your strength and your doom. She knew the next challenge was already forming beyond the horizon, and she intended to meet it as she had all the others, with a steady hand, a sharp mind, and a crew strong enough to follow her into whatever darkness lay ahead.
The darkness came sooner than she expected, not as a storm or a sudden clash of cannon fire, but as a shadow that slipped aboard in the shape of a man. They found him drifting in a small, half-broken dinghy 3 days after the convoy raid, a gaunt, sunburnt sailor clinging to a barrel for buoyancy. His story was a familiar one. His ship attacked and sunk by corsairs, his crewmates scattered or killed, himself left adrift with nothing but the mercy of the sea. The Queen listened, expression unreadable, as he spoke in the rasping voice of a man who had swallowed more salt water than he'd breathed air. He gave his name, Orwin, and swore he could work, swore he owed his life to her for pulling him from certain death. The crew, still riding the high of their recent fortune, welcomed him without hesitation, but the Queen's gaze lingered on him longer than most. She had seen too many men arrive in hard times and bring worse with them. For days, Orwin kept to the lower decks, hauling rope, scrubbing planks, patching sails without complaint. He ate little, spoke less,
and when he did speak, it was to praise the Queen's leadership in the way new men sometimes did, half awe, half calculation. Most took his quiet demeanor as humility. The Queen saw something else, an alertness in the eyes, a way he watched the deck's routines, noting where the weapons were stored, when the watch changed, who kept the keys to the captain's chest. She began to test him in small ways, sending him with messages to the boatswain, ordering him to fetch items from her cabin, watching for the subtle signs that might betray his intent. And soon enough, she had her answer. Late one night, while the ship rocked gently under a silvered sky, she caught the faintest shadow slipping from the storeroom where the rare spices from the convoy were kept. When the light of her lantern fell across him, Orwin froze, one hand clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between them like a rope ready to snap. Then, in a voice softer than the night breeze, she asked, "Do you know the cost of what you hold?" His answer was a stammer, a half-formed excuse about hunger, about debts owed in another port. She did not strike him, nor raise her voice. Instead, she called for two of her most loyal crew and had Orwin brought to the deck. The crew gathered quickly, roused from hammocks by the unusual summons. Orwin stood in the lantern light, the stolen goods laid bare at his feet. The Queen addressed the crew, her voice calm but carrying across the deck. "This man was dying when we found him. We gave him water. We gave him bread. We gave him purpose. And in return, he thought to take what belongs to us all." She let the words settle before continuing. "The sea takes what it will, but theft from your own ship is something I will not forgive." Her punishment was not death, at least not directly. She ordered Orwin to be put adrift in the same dinghy they had found him in, with a single oar and a single cask of water. No compass, no sail, just the open horizon and whatever fate the sea chose for him. The crew watched in silence as he was lowered over the side, the dinghy bobbing in the swell until it was swallowed by the darkness. It was a brutal act, but it sent the message she intended. Her mercy had limits, and her generosity was never to be mistaken for weakness. The crew returned to their duties with a renewed sharpness, the echo of that night settling into the unspoken code of the ship. Still, the incident left its mark on her. Orwin had been no ordinary thief. His manner, his questions, his quiet observations spoke of a purpose beyond hunger. She suspected he had been sent, perhaps by a rival captain or by those who hunted her for the bounty. The thought pressed against her like the weight of a coming storm. If someone had gone to the trouble of planting a man on her ship, it meant her enemies were not just chasing. They were probing, testing, seeking the weakness in her armor. And somewhere in that vast stretch of sea, they were already preparing their next move.
It came without warning. No distant sails on the horizon, no telltale smoke from cannon fire. Just the low, mournful moan of a foghorn carried across the dawn. The Queen was on deck before the crew fully roused, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the rolling gray that had swallowed the sea. This was no ordinary fog. It was dense, heavy, almost deliberate in the way it muffled sound and sight. A ship could creep within pistol range before you ever knew it was there. The crew moved like shadows in the gloom, their footfalls dampened on the wet planks. She ordered the sails trimmed and the guns run out, their muzzles vanishing into the haze. Every man and woman knew to keep silent. Sound carried strangely in weather like this, and one wrong noise could betray their position. Then, through the thick air, came a faint rhythm, the slow, measured creak of another ship's timbers. Whoever they were close. The queen did not shout orders. Instead, she leaned toward the bosun and spoke barely above a whisper. The crew adjusted, lowering the anchor just enough to halt their drift without the sound of chains splashing into the sea. The ship became a still thing in a moving world, the fog curling and folding around it. And then, like a ghost, another hull slid into view, black against gray, close enough that she could see the faint gleam of wet rope. It was a brig, running dark, no colors flown. A pirate's trick, but not hers. She recognized the cut of its sails, the squared prow painted with a crude emblem of a serpent devouring its own tail. Serpent's bite. A rival ship captained by vain Morholt, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty, and whose hatred for her had become the stuff of whispered legend in Nassau's taverns. This close, there was no room for cannon fire without tearing both ships apart. Morholt had not come for a battle. He had come to board. The queen's mind worked faster than the fog. If she let him bring the fight onto her deck, the advantage would be his: numbers, brutality, the chaos of close combat. But the fog could cut both ways, and she would use it to turn predator into prey. She gave a single nod, and her crew moved into position. Grappling hooks were made ready, not to defend, but to attack. On her silent signal, the queen's ship surged forward under a quick haul of the sails, the sudden motion startling the men on the serpent's bite. Hooks bit into the brig's rail, ropes went taut, and before Morholt's crew could react, her people were swarming across the gap. The fight was swift and vicious, waged in the half-light of the fog. Blades flashed, pistols roared muffled by the mist, and bodies collided in the narrow spaces between masts. The queen herself moved through it like a shadow, striking where the lines wavered, cutting down any who thought to challenge her directly. She did not waste motion or energy. Every thrust and parry was precise, every step calculated to keep her in control of the chaos. Morholt appeared through the fog like a figure from a nightmare. Tall, broad, his face split by a scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a perpetual sneer. His blade found hers in a clash of steel that sent shudders up her arm. He fought with brute force, seeking to overpower, but she had no interest in matching strength for strength. Instead, she let him press, retreating step by step toward the brig's stern. What he did not see, what the fog hid from him, was the narrow rope her crew had stretched between the mast and the railing behind her. At the last possible moment, she sidestepped, her blade flicking his aside. Morholt's momentum carried him backwards over the rope, his arms flailing as he toppled into the black water below. The splash was swallowed almost instantly by the fog. His crew, seeing their captain vanish, faltered. The queen's voice cut through the haze, cold and sharp. "Drop your weapons or join him." They obeyed. Within minutes, the serpent's bite was hers. She ordered it stripped of supplies, its gun spiked, and its remaining crew set adrift in their own longboats, enough food and water for a few days, but no more. By the time the fog began to lift, her ship was already sailing away, the silhouette of the crippled brig fading into the distance. The crew moved with a quiet satisfaction, their confidence in her renewed and sharpened. But the queen knew this was only the beginning. Morholt was dangerous, but he was just one rival among many, and now his death or survival would ripple through the pirate world like a stone cast into still water. Some would fear her more, others would come for her with greater determination. The sea did not allow a throne to remain unchallenged for long. And somewhere beyond the next horizon, the true reckoning for the price of her allure was gathering.